and welcome to the Plant School podcast. I'm Rachel Tenney, and here we learn all about plants, how they work, how to care for them, and it's all taught in a way that anyone from beginner to expert can listen to, understand, and enjoy. So I hope that you will join me in Plant School. Hello and welcome to the Plant School podcast. We have a lot to cover today, and you might not think so with it being the topic of variegation in houseplants, but there's actually a lot of fascinating information that comes with this topic. Before we jump into all of it, though, we're going to do our giveaway winners. If you're familiar with this podcast, I do a giveaway every single episode. I post episodes every other week, and I take someone who has left a review on Apple Podcasts, and I also take a winner from someone who has commented on the most recent episode of Spotify. Those are my two major listening platforms, so I'm trying to get all of you in there to have a chance to win if you would like. And speaking of, what you win as a giveaway winner is a package from Market Botany. They give you a bottle of their Prop Drops, which is a water propagation aid, as well as a bottle of their Leaf Shine. Both I have used and I loved. If you want to check them out, you can actually go to marketbotany.com. You can use code PlantSchoolPodcast and you can get 10% off. But let's jump into today's winners. So someone who left a review on Apple Podcasts, their username is Aileen from Chicago. And they said, I love the research and resources Plant School Podcast provides. Thank you for putting in so much work into this podcast. I love it. Thank you, Aileen, for that sweet review. Whenever you guys tell me that you love this podcast, it really keeps me going. So I really do appreciate your guys' kind words. And Aileen, I really do appreciate your review on Apple Podcasts. If you want to email me at tennyplants@gmail.com, that's TENNEY plants@gmail.com, I will get your address and we will get that giveaway package from Market Botany sent your way. And then hopping over to Spotify, our last episode that you guys were commenting on was the Hoya Care Guide. And I asked you guys to comment if you have ever owned a Hoya or to just comment anything you would like. And our winner today, I have a random number generator pick our winner. And I'm really excited because this person, they commented this a few hours ago, so they barely snuck in when their number was picked. Their name is Rachel Cook. And she said, today is my first time listening to your podcast, and I'm absolutely obsessed. I have 3 different Hoyas, and I'm so obsessed. Well, fellow Rachel, thank you so much for commenting. I'm so glad that you found my podcast. I'm glad you're enjoying it. And please email me at tennyplants@gmail.com, and I will get your giveaway package sent your way. That is some amazing luck to start listening to a podcast and be the giveaway winner. I hope you enjoy those Prop Drops and Leaf Shine once they arrive to you. All right, and if you would like to enter in the next giveaway, so next episode I'll announce 2 winners, go ahead and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or if you're listening on Spotify, just scroll down and leave a comment. Let's see, with our episode being about variegation today, I want you to go ahead and comment if you own a variegated plant, and if so, what kind. If that question's not applicable to you or you don't really want to answer it, that's fine. You can comment anything you'd like, and that enters you into the giveaway as well. I do not pick and choose which ones qualify or which ones don't. And if you'd like, you can do both. Even if you don't normally listen on Apple Podcasts, you can log in over there, leave a review. That'll just maximize your chances of winning. Or if you don't normally listen on Spotify, you can log in and just leave a comment. That's totally fine with me. All right, let's dive right in. Let's learn about variegation. I covered this topic way at the beginning of this podcast, way back in 2020. It was episode 22. If you're going to scroll back and try and find it, it's not there. It's been archived. Those first 50 episodes of my podcast were quite different from what they were now. For one, I had my husband on the podcast, and he would actually ask me questions that I had pre-written for him. And the whole idea when I started this was like, my husband, who knows nothing about houseplants, was going to ask me questions that someone might want to know about houseplants and how to care for them, so that it was kind of like we were all learning together from maybe people who feel intimidated by really jargony podcasts about plants. Anyways, it was pretty time consuming for both of us to do that, especially as we have had more babies join our family. So he stepped away, I've continued, blah, blah, blah. You didn't need to know that whole backstory. Maybe you already knew it when I've talked about it in some of my previous episodes, but that is to all say I have covered this topic, so it was really fun to dust off this information I had written down and add so much more to it. Actually, at the end of the podcast, I talk about some of the more expensive and rare variegated houseplants that have sold, and there's been actually a lot of really interesting events in the houseplant world with variegated houseplants, and it was really fun to look back and see that houseplant sales for variegated houseplants have just gone so crazy. But I will get to that. I want to start with the question of what is variegation. So, in the simplest of terms, it's basically the appearance of differently colored zones in the leaves, stems, or fruit of a plant. That is what variegation is. It's just different colored zones on a plant. Usually, we are looking at the leaves in the houseplant world because the foliage is what draws us to houseplants. It's what we're showing off 99% of the time. And the word variegation, it can be really loosely used in the plant world. The word variegated actually comes from the Latin word variegatus, which means made of various sorts of colors. And we're going to go through each type of variegation and what each one of them means. But you could say that the true variegation is the absence of plastid pigments, and it causes a sector of the leaf or stem to have white patches. And if you're like me, and you didn't know what plastid pigments were, don't worry, I looked them up. It's kind of a generalized term for something you're probably more familiar with, and that's chlorophyll. So a plastid pigment, it's a colored molecule within a plastid, and they give the plant its color. And for the example of chlorophyll, the pigment is chlorophyll, gives that plant its green color, and the plastid is a chloroplast, which houses the chlorophyll. In variegation, it can be on the fringe of leaves, it can be irregular dots, broad panels, it can be spots, it can be a totally white leaf, but it is basically just the absence of chlorophyll in that plant's leaves. And if you're wondering how we even got variegation in our houseplants, it actually occurs very rarely in nature. It's theorized that it perhaps occurs to help a plant maybe blend in so it can't be seen by herbivores, or it can increase its photosynthesis efficiency when it's in low light conditions, basically turn off the chloroplast to save energy. But research is ongoing and they aren't really sure why variegation occurs in the wild. So if it occurs very rarely in nature, how are we getting these variegated houseplants? Well, besides them being found, like in tropical rainforests where they are naturally growing, they are actually cultivated in greenhouses in the horticultural world. And this applies not only to indoor houseplants, but also with outdoor ornamental plants because we love it. We love color. We love different variegated varieties. They're really desirable. They're interesting to look at. And so we cultivate them to be that way via propagation methods. So for example, if they find one out in the wild that's variegated, they will take that plant and clone it via propagation, tissue culture, things like that to keep that variegation going. Or they can heighten the probability of a plant becoming variegated. I gave the example of tissue culture because that can actually increase your odds of having variegation happen via genetic mutations, because that is where that true variegation is coming from. It's a genetic mutation, it's happening randomly, and horticulturists will increase their odds of this happening by stressing out the plant, by doing tissue cultures, and then propagating it from there. And it's really cool because there's actually a way to tell if a houseplant, or any plant really, has been found variegated in nature or if it has been cultivated to be variegated. So when you are reading a plant's Latin name, its genus, species, and the italicized word variegata is its species name, for example, like an aloe variegata. That means that it was found in the wild with variegation. But if it is a capital variegata, it's not in italics, it's in single quotations, and it's after its genus species. For example, let's just take a a fiddle leaf fig. So it's Ficus lyrata variegata, and it's capitalized, it's in those single quotations. That means that it was a cultivar of this plant, and it was bred to be variegated. It was not found in the wild. And this is the much more common option when it comes to houseplants. And that is simply because it is easier to cultivate variegation than it is to find it in the wild and go from there. All right, so let's talk about the different types of variegation. In case you are unfamiliar, there are quite a few types. The first one we'll start with is marginal variegation. So this is colored patterns along the edge of the leaves or the margin of the leaves, kind of like the veining of the leaves. Some examples include variegated rubber plants, Ficus starlight, and Pothos and Joy. So all of those plants are examples of marginal variegation. Next is central variegation, and you can probably guess what it is. It's variegation in the center of the leaves, usually surrounded by a solid green color. So some examples of this are Hoya tricolor and variegated Hoya australis. Next, there's mosaic variegation, and this is more irregular variegation with patches or streaks, and they appear randomly on the leaves. Examples of mosaic variegation are marble queen pothos, golden pothos, and the network calathea, or calathea. I heard someone say that on Instagram, calathea, and I had to rethink if I've been saying it wrong. I think actually both are fine to say. I'm just going to stick with calathea because that's what I've been saying my whole life. Moving on, next is sectoral variegation. This is where there are distinct sectors or sections of a leaf that become variegated. And this type of variegation, sectoral, is probably the most sought after by people collecting variegated plants. For some reason, we like the look of this one and we want to collect it. So examples of this are like the Hoya crimson queen, Philodendron Brazil, Philodendron pink princess, and the variegated umbrella plant. And I have 3 more types of variegation. There's a lot of them, which is surprising to me. There's blotched variegation, which honestly, blotched sounds very similar to mosaic, because mosaic was those irregular variegation patches, and blotched is large patches of variegation or color that appear on leaves. But they are different. So some examples of blotched variegation are Maria Chinese evergreen, the Calathea alex, and the Croton petra. Then we have striped variegation. This one's pretty easy. It's where the leaves appear to have long stripes running their entire length. So that could be like your snake plants, prayer plants. That's your Maranta lucineras. They have striped variegation. You have Philodendron Birkins and Zebra calatheas. Those are all examples of striped variegation. Lastly, there is spotted variegation. It's small spots or dots scattered across the leaf surface. And examples of this are your polka dot begonias, your polka dot plant, and speckled cast iron plant. So those are all the different types of variegation. And now I want to talk about there being consequences to a leaf being variegated. Because these variegated zones, in the true sense of variegation, are zones where chloroplast is missing. There's no photosynthesis occurring in these areas. Therefore, they have lower potential to fix carbon dioxide into sugars and create energy for itself. So because of that, they actually tend to grow more slowly. So anytime you do have a plant that has those big white spots of variegation, just know that it's going to be a slower grower. And I talked about all the different types of variegation just a second ago. And I kind of want to come back to it because, for example, like in striped variegation, I gave the example of like a prayer plant, the Maranta. And that one, the variegation is just different colors. And that's us using that term variegation very loosely. If we want to hone in on the true meaning of it being lack of chlorophyll, it's white areas on a leaf or stem. That's what I'm referring to when a plant is going to be more slow growing. Because a prayer plant with its normal coloring is not going to be slower growing just because it has different colors on it necessarily. They're going to be slower growing when they have those white spots that have no chlorophyll in it. I just wanted to make sure there was no confusion around that. Next, I want to talk about what causes a plant to become variegated. What are the mechanisms behind it working? And I mentioned before that sometimes it occurs in the wild, perhaps to blend in. There's actually another theory that I ran across that perhaps it's a defense mechanism so they can appear to be infected by a viral infection or by leaf miners, which are just little insects that eat away at the inside of leaves, so that herbivores or the leaf miners themselves will not be attracted to that plant. So those are all possible theories of why plants have that variegation. So let's talk about what causes this. I'm going to talk about all the different types of variegation when it comes to the loose meaning of it before I get into that true sense of variegation I've been talking about with the lack of chlorophyll. So let's start there. Variegation in the loose sense of the word. There is pigmentary, and that is a plant using other pigments besides green, using their anthocyanins. These are natural patterns. They are not mutations. And again, we can go back to our example of the prayer plant, the maranta plant, your calatheas. They have different coloring in them, and it is a natural coloring. It's not a mutation. Next, there's blister/reflective variegation. This one's kind of fun. This is actually tiny air pockets that have formed between the pigmented lower and unpigmented upper layers of the leaves. So the light kind of reflects off of these pockets of air. It gives them kind of an iridescent silvery appearance. You can find this in your watermelon peperomias, satin pothos. There's also some anthuriums, alocasias, and philodendrons that do this as well. Another type of variegation in the looser sense of the word is caused by pathogens, by viral infections. They cause these patterns to appear. They're called mosaic viruses, not to be confused with the mosaic variegation patterns. These are viruses. And when I looked it up, these viral infections, I don't know why we even call it variegation because it's quite unpleasing. It's more like these splotches and specks of yellow on your plant's leaves. Your plant looks sick, and it is because it is sick. It is weakening the plant. It can cause stunted growth, and the two most common types of these viral infections are the tobacco mosaic virus and the cucumber mosaic virus. Some houseplants that are susceptible to them, and there's quite a few that I'm going to name here. There's spider plants, peace lily, rubber plants, philodendrons, pothos plants, snake plants, zizis, and your dracaenas. They are all susceptible to these mosaic viruses. It spreads via tobacco products or other infected plants. So if you don't have it in your home already with a plant that's infected, it's not something to really worry about. If you happen to use tobacco products in your home, there can be a risk, but let me just tell you this. Once upon a time in my plant disease and pest class, we infected tomato plants with the tobacco mosaic virus, and it took some work. We all got, I believe it was a single cigarette, and we opened up the cigarette, we took out the tobacco leaves, and we added water to them, made it kind of into a mush, and made a scratch onto the tomato plant's leaves, kind of roughed it up, and then applied some of that tobacco leaf paste onto it. So we really had to inoculate the leaf so that we could see the tobacco mosaic virus. It's not something that will just happenstance come upon a houseplant. If someone is smoking a cigarette nearby, I'm pretty sure it has to be a more physical contact and tissue has been broken on a plant. So don't be too worried about that happening to your houseplant. Just know that it is considered a type of variegation, though kind of an unpleasant one. And lastly, before we get to true variegation, we have artificial/chemical variegation. This is where plant manufacturers can use chemicals to produce a temporary change in color, or they can use paint, which is cheating. It's not fair. Actually, both of these, paint and using a chemical for a temporary change, just feels like cheating to me. A really popular example that you may or may not be familiar with is the pink Congo. So the pink Congo, it like exploded in popularity, this pink houseplant. But it was found out that they used chemicals that prohibit chlorophyll to produce these pink leaves. And guess what? It only lasted like 6 to 12 months. So people were paying like $200 for these plants, and they didn't know that the pink leaves wouldn't last. They would be gone in 6 months to a year, and it led to a lot of outrage, as you can imagine. Perhaps I'll have to cover that in an episode all by itself. But let's get to the true variegation. It's called chimeral variegation, and it's the presence of 2 different types of plant tissue. Like I said, this is like the real variegation. It is the most common type of variegation in the houseplant world. This is the type of variegation that people are really looking for when it comes to collecting houseplants. It's caused by genetic mutations, and it causes irregularities in the production of its chlorophyll. Like I mentioned, the way they keep this variegation going and mass produce it is via propagation. Whether they are doing it via cuttings, via seed production, or by tissue cultures, that is how they are preserving that variegation. And it's also important to note, perhaps you have a variegated plant and you want to make more of it, you want to take a cutting, just know that cuttings with complete variegation, so it is like a solid white leaf. It may be difficult, if not impossible, to have that cutting propagate, because if you get a white leaf, how is it getting its energy? It needs some sort of chlorophyll to produce energy to grow. So just know that it is nearly impossible to create an entirely white plant by a white leaf, because your plant does need some way to obtain its energy. I would say most popularly, tissue cultures are used to keep that variegation going. Alocasias are a really common example of this because they will actually mutate more often when they are propagated via tissue culture. And I've been saying tissue culture this whole time, not even explaining what it is. So if you're not familiar, it's basically taking a small piece of a plant, sticking it into a sterile growing medium, usually like an agar plate that you used in your science classes growing up. They stick it in that little petri dish in the agar, and it grows from there. And once it has started growing, they pick it up by little tweezers, they put it into soil or some other growing medium, and it can grow from there. It's a great way to like mass produce plants with very little inventory, because you're taking just small pieces of that plant. So it's a very popular way to go with greenhouses doing large productions, and they do have those sterile environments to mass produce those plants. And with this variegation, since it's a genetic mutation, it can revert back to being solid green. And this brings me to a really important point when it comes to your variegated houseplants, which is, what do you do if your variegation is just disappearing off of your houseplant? Because this can happen quite often. So let's take a few steps back. Let's say you have a variegated houseplant and you want to keep it that way. It's looking great, it's not disappearing, but you want to make sure the variegation stays. First things first, your variegated houseplant is going to need sufficient sunlight. Because it is lacking that chlorophyll, you want to make sure that those green portions are able to get enough sun to produce the energy that it needs to keep up with its variegated leaves. You can trim away solid green leaves when necessary if they're starting to show up. And another point with keeping its variegation is, a lot of people say that you might need to water your variegated houseplants just slightly less because they can be more susceptible to root rot. Perhaps it's because they aren't taking as much water as your other houseplants that are solid green, because they have less solid green area that is expending energy to grow and taking up that water. But it is recommended to really watch its watering. Make sure you feel that soil of your houseplant before you water it. Another point to consider is that you want to avoid temperature fluctuations, and this was one I hadn't really thought of before, and I had to kind of look into, like, why does temperature affect variegation? And apparently just any sort of stress on a variegated houseplant can cause fluctuations in chlorophyll. So this would include temperature changes. If it's going through that stress of it being too hot and too cold, it can cause the variegation to become more or less pronounced. So if I did have to sum it up To keep your houseplant variegated, if it already is, you want to lessen its stress and give it sufficient light and sufficient nutrients via fertilizing. And early signs that your plant may be reverting back to its original solid green form can be seen in changes in its leaf color. And I'm specifically talking about the new growth lacking variegation or having less pronounced variegation. That may be a sign that I need to look at what might be stressing this houseplant out. Is it not getting enough sun? Is it going through a lot of temperature changes? Things like that. And this may seem counterintuitive, but removing completely white leaves can actually help them keep variegation elsewhere in the plant. I know they're kind of fun. If I got a completely white leaf, I don't know if I could chop it off. I would just be so excited because you don't see that very often. But just know it can hurt variegation in other areas of the plant because the plant feels like it needs more green to keep up with this white leaf that is doing nothing for it. And if your variegated houseplant has completely turned back to green, there's no more variegation in it, it is very unlikely to kind of turn it back, to make it variegated again. Optimal conditions can promote more variegation, but once it's gone, a full return to its variegated state is not guaranteed. All right, and moving on, let's talk about how variegation can be pretty rare. This is where we get into some of the prices of these plants, which I think is really fun. So one example, and this is the one plant I covered back in 2020 when I first aired this episode, was a mini monstera plant, a Rapidophora tetrasperma. It was variegated, obviously, and it sold at a plant auction for $5,300, $5,300. And this was in 2020. And I'm here to tell you, it's just gotten more crazy because we have had the wild ride of the variegated monsteras in 2023, maybe even earlier than that. They just exploded in popularity. And now that I'm thinking about it, perhaps I should do a whole episode on variegated monsteras and how that's been such a hype. I feel like we're still on the hype of it, but I feel like it's kind of toned down a little bit because greenhouses have finally caught up with production and they are mass producing them and you can find them for much more reasonable prices now. But there was a time where greenhouses were in the early production stages. They weren't selling them. They were just starting growing them. They saw the demand was there, but they couldn't just magically have the supply. So the supply that was available was going for very high prices. You could find a single leaf of a variegated monstera anywhere from like $100 for a very small leaf to a few $1,000s for a bigger plant that had a few leaves. My next example makes that first one in 2020, the mini monstera that sold for $5,300, seem so small. This was another mini monstera, variegated, that sold. It had 9 leaves, those beautiful white splotches, and it sold for $27,000. $27,000 for 9 leaves, guys. Oh, that's just so crazy to me. And I'm not done. There's more. Not last year in 2024. This was a little bit earlier. There was a Monstera adansonii, which I love. I have one myself. It's all green. It's not variegated, by the way. But the variegated varieties could fetch a high price. This one was put on eBay. I'm not sure how many leaves it had, but it sold for $38,000. Maybe this number just seems so astounding to me because I have yet to buy a home or something like that. But that amount of money for a plant just makes my brain hurt. Who bought it? This is what I want to know. Who bought it? What are they doing with it? Is it still alive? And what is their job? What are they doing for work? I gotta find this out. Maybe if I do that deep dive into the craziness of variegated monsteras, maybe I could track down the buyer and message them. That would actually be really interesting. I would want to know. What is going through that sweet little head. Anyways, moving on to my final little question I want to cover, and that is, can you create variegation at home? You may be able to guess from everything that we've talked about, but the answer is no. You can't. Not really, anyway. You could go and give your plant a viral infection, the tobacco mosaic virus, and that's technically variegation. But if you're wanting that lack of chlorophyll, those white spots, it can be very hard to do. You can create a tissue culture if you do have some sort of sterile environment, but it can be quite difficult and finicky to work with. But in the sense of perhaps taking your already variegated houseplant and taking cuttings from it and quote-unquote creating variegation with those cuttings, yeah, you can do it that way. But other than that, you're not going to have your houseplant just randomly have variegation occur in it if it's not already present. Because it's such a rare thing in the wild, don't expect it to magically just be common inside your home. It is quite a process for those cultivating these houseplants to induce that variegation in the first place. But with that, now you know all there is to know about variegation in houseplants. I hope you learned something new. Now you know what it is, how it gets there, how to keep it there if you have variegated houseplants, or you're able to better appreciate it for what it is. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you will join me in 2 weeks for a brand new episode of the Plant School Podcast. Thank you so much for being here and for listening to the Plant School Podcast. I hope that you will join me for our next episode. And if you would like to support this podcast and keep it going, there's a link down in the show notes of this episode where you can donate to this podcast. And I really appreciate all that help. Or you can go to my merch store, which is also linked in the notes of this episode, and you can find some really cool plant-related shirts and stickers. And if you want to support the podcast but spend no money, feel free to share it with a friend, leave a review. All these things greatly help me out and allow me to keep doing this. Again, thank you so much for listening and for being here at the Plant School Podcast.